Welcome to the Faster Podcast by FLO Cycling, the podcast where we talk about anything and everything that makes you faster on your bike. This is episode 30, and today we have Canadian cycling coach Steve Neal returning to the show. During our last interview with Steve, we learned that he can improve a cyclist's Fat Max Wattage by more than 100 watts. During this episode, we have a detailed discussion with Steve to learn what Fat Max Wattage is, how to increase it, and how it can make you a faster cyclist. Hey, this is Chris with FLO. When we're not producing this podcast, our team at FLO is designing some of the fastest carbon fiber bicycle wheels in the world. As a thank you for being a listener of our podcast, Faster by FLO, we wanted to offer you 20% off your next purchase of wheels at flocycling.com. Head over to our website and pick up a set of wheels to make you faster at your next race or ride. Simply use coupon code PODCAST, that's PODCAST, in all uppercase letters when checking out to get 20% off your order. Thanks again for listening to Faster. We hope you enjoy the show. All right, Steve Neal, welcome back to the show. How are you doing today?
Awesome. Perfect.
All right. I will say that you have quickly become the most popular guest on our show. You've been out, you were episode 27. We're now on 28, and you have surpassed all of our other shows, which is great. We've also been getting a bunch of excellent feedback about the episode that we did with you, and I think you've got some great feedback as well. Is that true?
Yeah, I had a lot of emails after the first one, and signed up a few clients from that, which are already sort of experiencing some benefits, and it's I don't know, it's pretty exciting to me because like your podcast was really only my second one ever, so it's been kind of a neat experience, that's for sure.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad we could help with that. That's kind of the point of this whole thing. So, all right. So if you haven't listened to our first episode with Steve, I highly recommend you start there if you're listening to this episode. The first episode was episode 27, and it's called Finding Your Athletic Potential with Steve Neal. It's going to help kind of give you a lead in to what we're talking about today. So everyone who listens to this show will know that we ask every guest our watt point question at the end of the show. And for those who don't know, the premise of the watt point question is if a rider follows the advice given by the expert on the show, how many watts will that add to their FTP? Now, we've been doing this show for more than a year, and Steve, your answer was one that I've never heard before. At the end of the show, you told me that you may not be able to add watts to a rider's FTP, but in the past you've added 100 watts to a rider's Fat Max Wattage in about 7 months. Now, I'll be honest, I had no idea what Fat Max Wattage was, and since that show, I think I've read enough to get a better part of a minor in exercise physiology, and you and I have also had some really great conversations offline that have been extremely helpful with helping me understand all of these concepts. So I want the topic of this show to be all about Fat Max Wattage, and I want to give this show a little bit of context by describing two cyclists with an identical FTP. So both of these riders, Rider 1 and Rider 2, will have an FTP of 300 watts. Rider 1 has a Fat Max Wattage of 150 watts, but Rider 2 has a Fat Max Wattage of 250 watts. So a 100 watt difference on the Fat Max Wattage. Steve, in our last interview, you said that even though these two riders have the same FTP, they are very different riders, and I want to figure out why that is during this show. So let's start with some general information, and how about if we can just start with having you define what Fat Max or Fat Max Wattage is?
So basically, there's a few different ways to find this, and we might jump around a bit as we talk, but
perfect.
If we use sort of a test using a metabolic cart that'll look at fat and carb utilization during a test, which many people may have had done or at least read about. I think it's probably maybe the most widely used way to get this information.
Okay.
So when finding Fat Max, you want to do a sort of a longer step test, if you will. So we talk a lot about step tests or VO2 max tests or maximal aerobic tests where we have usually 3-minute steps increasing about 25 watts at a time. So in order to start looking at metabolic information, we generally lengthen the test out to 5-minute steps. Most people are going to stabilize their fat and carb utilization around 4 minutes. So it gives us a nice balanced fat, carb, heart rate utilization relative to power. And so it does make for a longer test, which it really does give us better aerobic information.
Okay.
So, long steps, 5 minutes, and the whole time you're doing the test, you're using the metabolic cart, and you can see the percentage of fat that a person is utilizing for their total energy and their percentage of carbohydrates. So you can see it in actual numbers, like 20 grams of carbs and 40 grams of fat, but you can also see that as a percentage of their total energy.
Okay.
So when you see this on a graph, you just basically look at the highest, fat or lipid metabolism that shows up on the cart, and it'll have a heart rate and a wattage associated with it.
Perfect. Okay. So we referenced two riders at the top of the show, one with a higher Fat Max Wattage. What are some of the benefits of having a higher Fat Max Wattage?
So, I guess there's a whole bunch of health reasons that maybe we won't get into, but from a cycling sort of perspective, the higher your fat max is, then the lower utilization of carbohydrates that you have. So there's a lot of talk about being a fat burner and all these different things within cycling. And I think that that is true. If you have a higher fat max, then you're using more fat to fuel your performance. But the real, I guess, secret to that is that you're actually sparing glycogen. So this gets a little specific to what we're doing. So you've got really short duration things. Maybe let's call it cyclocross or time trialing. It's maybe under 45 minutes. Then you have lots of sports that are between 45 minutes and arguably up to 4 or 5 hours. And then you have other parts of cycling that are 8 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours, and some that are 24. So we generally, in a perfect world, it'd be great to take your fat max up to as close to threshold as possible if you're involved in a sport that has to go above threshold, which is everything except for really long duration, events, right?
Correct.
So the higher the fat max, the more you spare carbs. The more you spare carbs, the more you have access to them when you need them, and also for longer. So if you're in a 4-hour mountain bike event and you have a higher fat max, then you're going to be able to go up hills longer and go above threshold a little bit more because you have saved a lot of carbs for just when you go above threshold.
Okay. If you're doing like a crit, let's say a 60-minute crit or a 90-minute crit, the higher you get your fat max, you're just burning fewer carbs and you have more for the breaks and the high pushes that you need as well there, right? You recover faster too?
Yeah, I'm not going to pretend to say that you recover faster, but you definitely, you're using less, you're saving more glycogen for when you really need it. And so, conversely, if you have a really low max, I've just got a person's test in front of me that I can refer to as we talk here. And it's sort of more extreme than your example. This is a person with a 365 watt MAP, and this person's fat max was at the time 3 months ago, like 108 watts. So it can be low. It can be not, like, it can almost be non-existent. So what happens is these people have they can have great explosive power. They can really jam in the group, in the crit, but then if the crit's short under an hour, they're probably going to be okay. But if we start to get out in longer things, hour and 15 minutes, I find is this weird cutoff. But an hour and 15 minutes and longer, they're going to have issues late in the race where they're going to fade.
Okay, interesting.
And I'm not, I'm not going to be able to answer it sitting here on the couch about, I probably could get around to it with how many carbs are burnt in 45 minutes versus 75 minutes. That is a possible calculation.
Sure, yeah. Okay, and then you said that basically the higher you can get your Fat Max as a percentage of FTP, the better. So there's not an ideal number, just the higher you can get it, the better for pretty much any racer.
Yeah, I remember I think our any racer refers to our previous conversation where any racer means the most of the people that are listening and most of the people
Okay.
that are trying to get better,
Okay.
right? Because
Yeah.
having said that, like elite level riders have very high fat max capabilities. So
Okay.
when if you made me pick a number, I'd pick threshold.
Okay. So get it to threshold.
Get it to threshold.
Wow.
So you got someone, so I have a few people that it's at threshold or, 5 beats of heart rate below or 10 watts below. What that means is they can go do, 2 hours of endurance and 2 hours of sweet spot training and they just need water and they won't burn any carbs. They need minimal amounts of carbs. Maybe 20 to 50 calories per hour of carbs versus what most normal people need is like 225 to 350.
Okay, so that athlete too, let's say you're at threshold, your fat max is at your threshold.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean technically you could hold threshold longer than an hour? You can get it closer to 2 hours?
No, you'd be able to hold. No, it just means that it means that whole time that you're riding at threshold with whatever performance you have, you are sparing the carbs, which allow you to do harder efforts above threshold.
Perfect.
And so, no, you can't ride at threshold longer, but you can handle more jams above threshold.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. All right, so Bob Seebohar is famous for what is known as his metabolic efficiency point, and that's kind of where the crossover point between where you're burning fats and carbohydrates switch. So you are certified through Bob as a tester, if I'm correct. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about Bob's metabolic efficiency point and how that compares or relates to the Fat Max Wattage that we're talking about?
So basically, they're one and the same. So really, what the metabolic efficiency point is looking at is this percentage. If you have 100% of calories from energy, and you happen to be a 25% fat burner and a 75% carb burner, then you're not going to be able to spare much glycogen, as you ride because of this ratio. And so we want to change this ratio. And as we change the metabolic efficiency point, fat max also goes up. They are two different things, but they, 95% or more people that I test of all sorts of different fitness levels generally have what's called a level. There's 3 different levels. There's a person who's a carb burner first and does a fat burner first and does have a switch somewhere, right? They do have a metabolic efficiency point, which would be like level 2. Level 1 means over here to the left is you don't have one. It means you start burning carbs at 100 watts and you finish burning carbs at wherever you finish. Then there's level 3 way over to the right, which is you start burning fat and you finish burning fat right at the end of your step test. So over to the right are ultra runners, over to the right is where you want to be if you're like a 10-hour plus Ironman athlete, you're an ultra runner, you're doing 24-hour solo crazy things on your bicycle. That's where a level 3 metabolic efficiency point where they burn fat all of the time wants to live.
Okay.
Now they're not going to have any top end, but they don't need it.
Right.
So then the fun gets when you have these different sports from cyclocross to 5 hours on a mountain bike or something, where you want to have a metabolic efficiency point somewhere, and depending on the nature or the time duration of your sport, you might actually want to raise and lower it depending what you're doing.
Okay.
And I always use examples where, I just had a consult, a guy who I talk to every few months, and he's won, our national champion mountain bike race. He's won a few Grand Fondos. So he's kind of in this 1.5 hour range all the way up to 5 hours.
Oh, wow.
And so that person to win those 2 races, wants to learn how to move their metabolic efficiency point somewhat, because he could probably afford a little bit lower of a metabolic efficiency point, and I'll be exact about that in a moment, in the mountain bike race.
Okay.
But to have better performance in that big long Grand Fondo race, or at Worlds in Grand Fondo, it's like he wants to have a higher metabolic efficiency point. So he still has access to carbs for hard efforts, but the race is longer. So the higher the metabolic efficiency point, the more he's capable of sparing those carbs when he really needs them.
This is fascinating stuff. Okay, that makes a ton of sense actually. And I didn't realize you could move it that easily. So that's really cool.
So I've gone from like, let's just use training zones. So I've taken a person, say, from having a fat max in their endurance range. So if we pick a 75 kilo male rider,
Yep.
and their fat max is 185 watts when I meet them,
Yep.
you could move it in 3 or 4 weeks easily to 220 watts, and then getting it above your tempo zone is ideal, right? So think about what we're doing when we're doing endurance and we're doing tempo type training. We're doing training that we want to be muscular endurance that's predominantly based on fat. That's what we've always been told those things improve.
Okay.
But I know people who do their tempo based on a proper training zone that are carb burners, so they can still do tempo at 250 watts like the other person, but they have to eat 300 calories an hour to do it.
Yep.
Which has other issues with, you could even go as far as saying our teeth, and, eating and drinking so much sugar over a lifetime probably is hard on our teeth.
It's kind of crazy when you think about it.
But we need a lot. So we need it when you have a decent sized engine, which a lot of the listeners are going to have. If you switch from being even getting your fat capabilities, I always say if you can get them above your endurance zone, that's amazing. Because now you can do 70 to 80% with minimal carbohydrates in your bottle.
Okay.
It saves a lot of money. It's better for our health. Now, I think we're going to get into this, but it is kind of moving this point is probably 75% nutrition.
Awesome. All right. So let's talk a little bit about testing and performance numbers. So before we talk about how do you actually improve the fat max, I want to set the stage to give you a bit of an imaginary athlete to use as your reference. So let's say that rider one with the 300 watt FTP and the 150 watt fat max shows up at your doorstep and you begin coaching them. Let's say that they've been riding for, 1 to 2 years. I'm guessing that you're going to start working with this athlete by doing some testing and getting some baseline numbers. So if I'm correct in that assumption, can you talk about what type of tests you would do with a new athlete and what metrics you would want to collect? Max heart rate, fat max, threshold, etc.
Yeah, so I'd want to know their sort of VO2 max, or their maximal aerobic power. So, you've already defined their threshold as 300 watts.
Yep.
So then if they're in a decent balance, they're probably going to have an MAP that's approximately 15 to 20% higher than that. So let's talk 330 to 350 watt MAP.
Okay.
So right now you're talking about a lot of people I know. So a bunch of people at the gym, right? So a bunch of people at the cycling gym are these kinds of people, very fit individuals that have worked on a very solid MAP and a good MAP, but then they finally get the test done, and fat max is, I guess, the next biggest thing to start looking at. Okay. Because a lot of athletes who focus on threshold training, which we won't get into too much because we did that in the last podcast, but when they focus on a lot of that near FTP stuff, there's a lot of carbohydrate required to do that work. So if they have a low fat max and they're always doing this carbohydrate based training, so they're eating a lot of carbs and they're doing a lot of training that asks for a lot of carbs, their fat max will never grow. And so if they're racing for 75 minutes, 90 minutes, 2 hours, there's lots of people with the numbers that you are giving about athlete A that have very good results. And so if they're satisfied with the results, then it's really tricky to ask them to change the nutrition or to raise fat max, unless they want to, I think, do more racing, because doing more racing means they need a little bit more longevity in the fitness, which means they're probably going to have to do more endurance training. Doing more endurance training with a higher fat max is beneficial.
Okay.
And still, the number of people that have decent results, I mean, top five in grand finals that qualify you for worlds and have, you know, really poor Fat Max capabilities, they're in this funny situation where the same rider has a lot of trouble drinking in a road race. So they have trouble with their technical ability to drink in a road race. And I know a few people have been top five that just, how much do you drink? Well, I try to drink, but I find it really hard in the pack to reach for my bottle. So not only are they a carb burner, but they're not fueling their carb burning abilities because they're too
Right.
scared or don't have the technical ability to drink. So
It's a lot of riders,
it's a
actually.
lot of riders. So now if you can raise those people's fat max and they actually don't have to reach for the bottle because they don't need it for performance per se, it's a different ball game in these big kind of grand fondo type races.
Huh. Interesting. Okay, so we talked about the MAP test, or the maximal aerobic power test, on our last show. I've done some research on that since the show, and there are several versions of it. You have the British version, the Canadian version, which I'm guessing you're a fan of. Can you describe which version of the test that you use and why?
So the Canadian version that you found on the internet is kind of close, but it's even a little bit different. So the Canadian version, in a nutshell, would be approximately 20 to 25 watts every 3 minutes, and you go to failure, which means you don't necessarily mean to finish a 3 minute step. You just go as far as you can. Out of
Okay.
that test comes your peak 1 minute power. That would be considered your maximal aerobic power.
Okay.
Then some of the other tests would be ramping up quicker. So ramp the athlete up quicker so that they don't have muscular fatigue so early, like in a longer test. It inflates the MAP number. You still take the peak 1 minute power, but they got there quicker by having 30 watts every minute.
Okay.
I find that and I don't, one isn't right or wrong, because usually you're applying a test system to your training system. So what I find is, if I fiddle around and try different MAP tests, that if I have a certain group of workouts that I might say are 85% MAP workouts, but I
Yep.
use the British version of the test, that when
Correct.
I get to do that workout, will be able to finish it.
And the British version is the one that ramps up much quicker, like 25 watts a minute kind of thing, right?
Right. Now,
Okay.
that ramp up comes from more of a VO2 max protocol. So when you want to try to find someone's VO2 max, then you want it to ramp up quickly, so they're able to get to a high respiration rate, a high heart rate, and challenge their metabolic system to see what their VO2 max is.
Right.
If their muscles get tired, it's like saying, hey, go do 2 hours of tempo and then give me your best 5 minutes. It's not going to be the same as if I just say,
Yeah.
go give me your best 5 minutes. So that's one thing. But then in that world, you would then take that VO2 max power number and say, hey, how long can you ride on this number? Some people are going to ride on it for 4 minutes, and some people are going to ride there for 14 minutes.
Okay, that was what I was actually going to ask you. Some athletes, let's say they do the British version, or Zwift and Trainer Road kind of have that 25 watts a minute thing. And then you go do the workouts based on that number, right? So let's say the number you get to is 400 watts. You take 75% of that, it's 300.
Yeah.
I've noticed that some athletes seem to be able to do those efforts, or the intervals and the workouts, pretty easily, while others struggle. And I'm in Park City now, just on the way to Leadville. I was at a coffee shop the other day, and the guys were fans of the show. They actually said that your last episode was their favorite. And we got talking about this episode coming up. And one of the guys said, look, I've done this protocol where you do the 1 or 25 watts every minute, and I just can't hit the intervals. And I personally feel the same way, but I've talked to other guys who can do it. Is there a difference for different types of athletes?
Sure. We get into this whole anaerobic capacity sort of, I think we touched on that last time where we started talking about like anaerobic capacity or functional reserve capacity, or you're going to find that someone with a higher, in Training Peaks world, a functional reserve capacity that's higher is going to be able to probably do workouts off of the British version.
Okay.
Someone with a lower anaerobic capacity is probably going to have trouble with their number from the British version. But what's kind of left out of the equation is if you use, in my opinion, the person I would refer to the most is someone named Veronique Bilat or Biat. I'm Canadian, but I'm not super French. Billat.
Yeah.
So she's done a lot of work with 30-30s over the years, mostly with runners, but is I believe a leader in that kind of interval training. And one thing that is very different about her prescription of VO2 max workouts is you have your power that you have at VO2 max, but you also have a percentage of how long you can ride there. So we've got two athletes that do the Great Britain test, and one athlete, they both have 400 watt MAPs.
Okay.
But one athlete can ride there for 4 minutes and the other athlete can ride there for 7. I'm
Yep.
not just going to say you're going to do 30-30s at your MAPs. You're going to do maybe 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off at yours. The other person might actually do 40 seconds on, 40. So the length of the interval is based on the length of the ability to hold their VO2 max.
Okay. Interesting.
Whereas what we're used to, right? What we're used to seeing is, okay, here's your MAP test. You're going to do your VO2 max work at the same wattage and the same duration as the person beside you, as the person beside you, as the person beside you. And then you're going to see different results from the same workout. And I still believe that comes from the aerobic capabilities of the athlete.
Interesting. Okay, so you're tailoring the interval prescription based on the testing metrics that you're getting.
Yeah, which I think most people do. It's just that some of this stuff gets left out of the explanation, I think. So when we look at these MAP tests, that's why I say the Great Britain one isn't bad. There's a whole bunch of really fast people from there, right?
Yep.
So it's just the way they apply the test information. And I'm pretty sure they're not just going to find an athlete's MAP. They're going to find out what it is and how long they can hold it to help them prescribe better intervals.
Awesome. Okay, so as a coach, you're clearly focused on Fat Max. Is an athlete's threshold or FTP important to you in any way?
Yeah, absolutely. Because threshold and VO2 max are still these two great indicators of performance. So if I let's go over to, we briefly talked about different levels of metabolic efficiency points.
Okay.
So if we have an athlete with a 400 watt MAP, let's say, but they're level 3 metabolic efficiency point, which means they burn fat the whole time, then that's going to seem amazing in an Ironman bike leg when they're pushing 360 watts because they're capable of that. But then if you get that person to go in a road race, they're probably going to get dropped on the first climb.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden they're really high fat max no one cares about.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It does.
So I still believe in threshold. You still have to have the other energy systems involved, which kind of come down to sport specificity.
Yep.
Which we touched on in the first podcast, but I think we miss trying to develop this well-rounded engine first, and then you have an athlete with the guy I just did the consult with who can race for 90 minutes or he can race for 5 hours.
Exactly.
If he has to go to 8 or 12 hours, he probably needs to do some different training and some different nutrition strategies. But I bet you that person's still just as strong down to 12 minutes.
Okay.
So we are trying to help everyone become the best version of themselves that they can. And when we raise fat max, it is impossible to raise fat max without altering nutrition.
Okay.
So you can't be on some crazy 80% or 70% carb diet and have a really high fat max.
Okay, that's fair.
So there becomes some off the bike responsibility for the 8 to 12 hour rider, which isn't just going to help them on the bike. Like the people who I've raised fat max from, say, 125 watts up to 225. So nothing spectacular. They're not up to tempo. They're not up to threshold, but they've changed it an awful lot. Those people are top 3 kind of provincial level even winning masters riders in a mountain biking or road here in our province.
Okay.
And the same, one of the things they would all say is, I've been trying to lose 10 pounds for 10 years. And they raise their fat max, which means they needed to alter their nutrition somewhat. All of a sudden, now they've lost 11 or 12 pounds. And it's
Really?
stayed off all summer. They've never been able to lose it, blah, 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 blah. And all of a sudden it's just gone. And that's just, that's the ratio of carbs to protein in sort of, which is part of a big thing that Bob does with helping someone look at the nutrition off the bike. Because if you think about it, if you have a lot of carbs available floating around inside you, and then you go do this workout that requires a lot of carbs, then it's just going to keep accessing this, because carbohydrates are pretty awesome fuel.
Right.
But do we really need to be accessing 80% of our carb stores when we're riding at 185 watts doing endurance?
No.
Probably shouldn't be. And then there's a bunch of health benefits to that off the bike.
Interesting. Okay. Awesome. All right. So let's go back to, I want to reference something from the last interview that we did, and I want to get a little more clarity on what it means. So during the last episode, you said that an athlete should be able to hold 75% of their maximum aerobic power, which is the last minute of the step test that we do, for an hour with a steady heart rate of about 80% of your max. So I told you during that show that I personally would have a hard time doing that, and you said that meant my aerobic system was less than 75%. And as a coach, that you would want to get my aerobic system above 75%. You then went on to say that some athletes can't hold 75% of their MAP for 12 minutes without hitting VO2 max heart rates, which are much higher than 80%. So why are some athletes able to hold 75% of MAP for an hour with a steady tempo heart rate, while others are redlining in 12 minutes? Is this the aerobic system, or is it related to Fat Max? What happens there?
I think we can, in this part, kind of sort of relate let's take Fat Max out of the equation. It's more to do with aerobic capabilities and muscular endurance of the athlete. Now,
okay,
the aerobic capabilities of the athlete could be their heart rate, so stroke volume versus stroke frequency. So a person who has a bigger stroke volume can pump out more blood with a lower heart rate than a person who's working off of stroke frequency.
Okay.
Right. So that's one thing. So we have these so we've got our heart rate, we have our respiration. Those two things are kind of related. And then we also have muscular endurance and the ability to deliver fuel. So if you have two athletes that can only store a very similar amount of muscle in their glycogen, which everyone would kind of agree on, one person might be able to might have a bigger liver. So there's more ability to recycle lactate back into sugar in the liver if it's bigger, which kind of is something that's sort of known about endurance athletes, is they do tend to have bigger livers.
Okay.
So when you have, so if you have a person with a poor respiration system doing the workout, we can either provide oxygen to the body by beating our heart, right? So 180 beats a minute, we can provide a certain amount of oxygen liters per minute.
Yep.
But if my respiration system starts to fatigue after 25 minutes and I start taking shallow breaths, what'll happen is, because I'm not providing the same oxygen with my shallow breaths as I was with my deeper ones 10 minutes in.
Right.
So now my body it's still working at the same wattage because it's fixed, correct?
Correct.
So now our heart rate has to start to rise to provide the same amount of oxygen.
Yes.
So respiration is something else that we look at in a metabolic test, where we can see what is the percentage of what is the person's working respiration capacity on a bicycle versus what is their vital capacity being tested before they step on it. maybe another podcast, but there's a big range. But it's kind of really important. Everyone in the world would call this heart rate drift. So as you hold a fixed wattage over time, you see people's heart rates climb.
Yep.
A big part of that heart rate drift is actually because the respiration system is declining, so the heart rate has to respond. Those two things work together, but we see a lot of poor respiration adds to rising heart rate. But rising heart rate it's a factor. It also adds to perceived exertion, and perceived exertion might make this person quit before their hour's up.
Okay, and the respiration system fails because it fatigues? What's happening to the respiration system?
Yeah, so there's a few things. Number one, maybe the person's only using 35% of their actual vital capacity. So if you only know how to breathe a certain way to access 35% of your capacity, then you have to breathe really quickly.
Okay.
And
you can train
if
that.
you can access, absolutely. So, but if you could access 75% of your capacity, then you have a lot more oxygen available for your lungs, and now your heart rate doesn't have to go up as much.
Wow.
So anyways, we won't babble on, but those are definitely two things that do happen in this kind of hour-long thing with a fixed power.
Okay.
Now, if you do the test with a metabolic card on, it's kind of like a lower intensity version of a 20-minute time trial. So if you do a 20-minute time trial with a metabolic card on, a lot of people spend like 16 minutes of VO2 max.
Yep.
With a high percentage of VO2, which I misspoke there. They spend a high percentage of their time close to VO2.
Okay. Yeah.
So they're not at their VO2 max, but they're working at a functioning high capacity. So therefore, you go prescribe intervals off that number. So now these threshold intervals have a high kind of anaerobic component to them. So they don't really train that aerobic system below it, which is going to help improve this 1 hour time trial at 75%.
Okay.
So this is almost like, did you try it?
I did not. No, I was very specific for Leadville. So
So what'd be kind of neat is after Leadville, when you recover,
yep,
you should have a decent aerobic system, right?
I should.
Especially, right. So go do the test.
Okay.
And just do it once every 2 months. It's just what we see when we look at the gym, which is roughly 80 people. So take a VO2 max interval workout, and let's say it has 21 1-minute intervals in it with 1 minute off, broken into 3 sets.
Okay.
We see the person with, and most people would agree that, you want to see VO2 max workouts hitting about a 90 to 95% heart rate.
Okay. So
you see people who have a poor 1 hour time trial with a low kind of response, like they just can't stay below 80% heart rate. Those same people get well into, like, they get to 100% halfway through the workout and they just can't complete the workout. So with this, does that make sense? So they're doing this workout, they max out halfway through and they just can't finish. As their 1 hour time trial aerobic performance comes up, they're now able to actually finish their VO2 max workout.
Interesting. All right.
And their heart rate response is about normal. So you end up getting this better heart rate response in the lower workout, probably because the person's fat capabilities are rising. So they're sparing more fuel for longer into that 1 hour time trial. They don't have to change energy systems. So the higher your fat max in a test, the longer you're going to be able to probably last in this 1 hour time trial before you really switch and you see your heart rate start to go up.
Yep.
But this lower end test really also shows the person's maximal efforts are also improving without much training there.
Okay. Very interesting. Let's talk a little bit about training now, since we've covered the basics of this. So we'll get into nutrition after this, but let's go back to our sample athlete who showed up at your doorstep. Let's talk about some of the type of training you'll have them do to improve their fat max wattage. And I want to break this out by training phase. And I think you kind of prescribe to the base build peak. Is that fair to say?
Sure, but usually in a reverse periodization model, or actually, I'm not sure that's fair to say. So
Let's
I
just, for the sake of the show, let's do base
yeah,
build peak.
that's
Is that
fine.
fair?
No,
Okay,
yeah,
cool.
it's totally
Yeah.
fine.
All right. So let's kind of have you walk us through what a sample week of training might look like. We'll start with the base phase and maybe have you talk a little bit about the kind of workouts you would do to improve fat max, what their training distribution would look like by zone. So they're doing 80%, low intensity, 20% high, whatever. And then what metrics you would use in that phase to set their intensities. Because in our last show, you said a lot of people prescribe by wattage only, and you like to have heart rate kind of governors to drop them. You'll trim the wattage if the heart rate exceeds certain things.
So the first thing is now we're talking about our example athletes with the 300 watt FTPs and the high and low fat max. So we've got the low fat max person at the door, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So we've got really good thresholds, which means we're assuming that they're kind of in line and they've got a good MAP as well, but they've got a
Yeah.
low fat max.
Correct.
So this person with those other two really good numbers, I would focus just trying to raise fat max. So I would probably stop doing any intensity above threshold at all.
Okay.
And the first thing I would do I'd start a lot of sort of sweet spot training, and I would base that off of testing, and I would look at where when you see a metabolic test, you can have a fat max of a very low number, but then they can ride with their carbs and fat kind of running in a linear fashion for quite a while, and then they really start to change, and one goes up, one starts to go down before fat runs to zero. So I would probably just run pretty normal training zones for sweet spot that anyone can relate to.
Yep.
Except I would put a heart rate governor on it of like 83%. So I might start right off the bat with 3 by 20 minutes, 3 days a week with a day of easy endurance between. So let's just say everything surrounding this is easy endurance, but I'd start them right off the bat with 3 by 20. Keeping in mind, most people do 3 by 10, 3 by 12, 3 by 15, 2 by 20, 3 by 20. So I would start them right off at 3 by 20, but I would have a heart rate ceiling. And so when you take a person like this that steps up to the door and you give them a heart rate restriction, they might start off at sweet spot wattage of whatever, 250 watts, but by the end of 20 minutes, they've faded to like 228.
Right.
So because of the heart rate ceiling, because what we eventually want to have is those two things in line. And so we start off with 3 by 20. What it does is the program almost builds itself because of the heart rate limiter. There's going to be only as much muscular fatigue as the athlete can handle aerobically. Right. So I'm not saying that they couldn't do 3 by 20 at 250. They just can't do 3 by 20 at 250 with their heart rate in the same zone as their power. And
does that heart rate governor, does that help prevent athletes from injuring themselves because they're not overdoing the muscular system?
I don't know about injury per se, but I would definitely help from overtraining, which is what we see a lot in programs without a heart rate present, is the athletes just get really tired. Their legs get sore.
Yep.
So if you've ever experienced that or have had friends have that, as soon as you put a heart rate governor on that person and they do it for 6 weeks, they're already going to feel better. They're going to be like, hey, can I do 3 by 20 4 days a week? And so first step is giving or protecting. I call giving a rest day or something in between a workout, protecting that focused workout. So you start off with 3 by 20, but you've got a governor so that really they might be starting in sweet spot, fading into tempo, fading into endurance, right?
Correct.
You just keep rolling until they're actually doing the workout you want them to do by power. Then I would start blocking it together. So now we've got an athlete, we're 2 months into this, pretty exciting, right? They've been doing 3 by 20 for a while now. The power's starting to come up. The heart rate's in line. So now they don't have any more time in the week because they only have 12 hours or 8 or 9. So now you have to still increase their training stress. So now you do 2 days of 3x20s, 1 day easy, 1 day of 3x20s, 1 day easy. So you start to block the workouts together
Yep.
because the second day they're going to be a bit tired. So now I would be patient and I would look for the same response in a blocked version of the same workout.
Interesting.
So then they're going to slowly adapt to that. Now, the whole time you block a workout together, now instead of getting 3x20s in a week or whatever the number you want to pick, you're going to get 4 workouts in 7 days, right?
Yep.
And eventually, or 3 workouts, then you're going to get 4. Then you might get even 5 in 9 days. So what starts to happen is you can really build the person's TSS or XSS and exert. You can build their training load because you're not making them train harder, but they're more capable of the aerobic training without the fatigue that goes with, in my opinion, no heart rate governor.
Okay. Are you doing any long rides in that phase at all, in the base phase, like a 4 or 5 hour weekend ride?
I would always say the longest ride will be based on the person's abilities. So you might have a person that only has 8 to 12 hours, but so it's really you could get a long ride. I always say as long as possible with the time they have. And I really like 4 hours as a minimum. 5 hours is amazing. So if the person has, 3 really good days of sweet spot training and they're not tired, but they back off a bit in between and they can squeeze out one 4 hour ride, that's a pretty awesome aerobic training block.
Yeah. Okay.
So it depends on the person. Like sometimes I start them at 3x15, but I guess my point is you could just start at 3x20 if the person has time, because you can warm up for 15 minutes. You can do 3x20 with a 5 to 8 minute recovery. You can do all of this in under 2 hours.
Yep.
And because there's a heart rate governor, that it just kind of looks after itself.
Okay.
One little side note is that you can, I don't find it often, if you start with a person who's recovered and in good shape, it takes a lot of training to get heart rate depression. So think about it, if you have a heart rate ceiling, but a person's in a situation where their heart rate is depressed, then they can start to over push the wattage.
Yeah.
So basically, you've generally had a bunch of good workouts where you're riding at a certain wattage, you've got this heart rate ceiling, and it feels a certain way. It's not muscular. You're always telling yourself, "Oh, I wish I could go harder. I know I can push the wattage." That's when the rider would always say it's too easy.
Okay.
Then all of a sudden they get in this situation where they're like, "Wow, this isn't easy anymore. I feel like I'm time trialing." They do have to. This is where it gets tricky because it might be months in, but you don't want to train this kind of training in a depressed heart rate situation.
Okay. And just for those listening, can you describe what depressed heart rate is?
Well, depressed heart rate is going to be probably the easiest way to think about it is when you have to work really, really hard. So you've been riding at 220 watts for 3 or 4 weeks, and all of a sudden you have to push 240 to get to 80%, but you feel terrible. That's a situation where the heart rate's depressed. So you're trying to get the heart rate up to this place or not let it go, but it's not even close. Some people will then tend to push harder. That's a mistake.
Okay. And that comes from fatigue, right? That depression?
Yeah, so when the muscles start to get tired, they can't drive the heart rate up. So tired muscles, the heart rate response starts to come down. So if you try to push harder to get heart rate response, you're just digging yourself into a deeper hole.
Okay. Are you ready to jump into the base phase? Is that a fair enough example of a base phase for you?
Sure. What's the next one?
Build phase. Sorry. So build phase.
So build phase. I honestly would. Let's say by the base phase, we've had a person. I think we have to have something, because I might not take them out of the base phase if they're still improving. But so let's say they're doing 3x20. We've got a little bit of block training. They're capable of really good workouts over and over again. Same wattage, 83% heart rate ceiling. They still feel great. Then I would probably sort of inject a little bit of VO2 max or anaerobic. So I'd take a break from that for a few weeks.
Okay.
And I'd probably retest Generally, when we retested this time, the person, it's their first experience with, wow, my MAP just went up and I did 2 months of, sweet spot. How's that possible? So now all of a
Yeah.
sudden they have a whole bunch of confidence in their MAP going up because of the aerobic contribution to that system.
Okay.
But it still doesn't mean that you don't need to go keep them sharp, or else they're just going to turn into that sort of really high fat max person with no top end. So
Okay.
if they've come into a balance, their power and heart rate are in line, they're managing the workouts really, really well, you could just keep going. But after a few months, 6 to 8 weeks, I would probably interject a few weeks of VO2 max or anaerobic capacity training. And I would just try to figure out which one the person needs the most. So if the person can handle really, really, really hard starts, then they probably have a good anaerobic capacity. So I might work on their VO2 max.
Okay.
If the person has terrible starts, but they can hold a pretty high pace and their tempo workouts are going well, I'd probably, get them to do some anaerobic capacity work. And we're just trying to do something like high intensity that's going to help that system improve over a couple of weeks, because it only takes 2 or 3 weeks to improve those systems. And then you'd probably just go back to blocking together the tempo training, because um, you can get an unbelievable amount of tempo work done and training load built, as if you just dabble in higher intensity training to make sure you don't get too flat.
Okay. Okay.
That's the
Just
hardest part for people to gather, right? It's like, how can I possibly train for 2 months? Now you might throw in like one group ride every couple of weeks and just say, hey, man, go crazy, go tear people's legs off if you feel good. Because
get after it. Yeah.
that one workout's not going to spoil this whole aerobic build phase.
Right.
So,
Are athletes in the base and build that we just described, are athletes also improving their FTP during this, or their threshold?
what I usually find is that maybe FTP defined the way we're, I guess, talking about is it may not go up much, but they might be able to
Okay.
do 2 tests in a row at the same wattage. So,
Okay.
you know,
Okay.
when you do an FTP test and you're done, take 10 minutes, take 10
Yes.
minutes off and just do it again. And what if that next test is 99% of the first one? That's pretty awesome.
That's
Whereas
amazing. Yeah.
before,
Okay.
it had so much anaerobic component to your 20-minute time trial. There's no way you could repeat it even close. But if you
Absolutely.
have a much
Absolutely.
more aerobic component to your test, then you can do another one.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit. So we just described the base and the build. What about the peak phase? What would change with training in the peak phase for you? I guess that depends on the event a bit, right?
It does, but you know what I guess I'm going to always assume we're just talking about 90% of the people who are trying to get better out there, and that's people doing different kinds of races, maybe mountain bike races, gravel races, different durations, 2 hours, 8 hours. Usually we're also talking about people who need an increase in their aerobic capabilities. So when you're trying to increase those capabilities, you might only need a short wee 4-day taper.
Okay.
So if you've got a person who has a really big base, then you can afford a bigger taper phase or peak phase,
Right.
right?
Right. Right.
But most of these people are probably still trying to work on this phase, and so you might just have them do a couple of races a few weeks out of their goal race, partially for intensity, bike handling, mental capacity. Like, hey, let's go remember what it's like to suffer. And I
Yep.
generally find that 3 hard workouts, preferably races, will really sharpen people who have a good base.
Okay.
So I guess what I'm saying is the peak phase is generally not some big long taper, because then they start losing fitness that they're really trying to gain, and they're trying to gain it over the next year or two versus the next month or two.
Okay.
They're trying to gain something they know they can keep for a long time. So, yeah, a listener from the previous podcast who I coach has had a goal of an event done a bunch of times, really wanted to come 10th, finish 4th, could not believe it's a whole bunch of 3-minute repeats in this road race. a bunch.
Okay.
He
And
could
how?
not understand how raising his sweet spot can help him. And then now he's like, okay, I get it.
Okay. So just for the listeners, from our last episode, you started talking to a guy. How long did you train him? And his goal was 10th, and now he was 4th. How long did it take you to do that?
If you can give me less than 30 seconds, I will pull up. I think it's been 2.5 months, not even.
Wow.
And the biggest difference is like, if you'll use software, his threshold hasn't changed. So I always use Exert and I use WKO4. And in software, this person's fitness hasn't changed because remember, most software requires some kind of injection of intensity to analyze threshold power, right?
Yes.
So if the person's always doing sweet spot or tempo or endurance, then the software thinks that they're getting out of shape. So once in a while, I would have this person do a workout that was so far away from what we've been doing. And he would just always be surprised how easily he could pull off such a high intensity workout. Which then starts to relate to racing. It's like, well, if you can do this 60-minute, really high intensity short interval workout, then it's because your recovery is better because you're not digging into your stores as much as you were before with your lower fat max.
Correct. Okay. And you said you're pulling this up?
Yeah, I'm trying. You keep talking.
Okay. I wanted to get into nutrition, but do we want to wait to get into nutrition until you get this guy pulled up?
We'll come back to it for 5 seconds. It won't take long.
So okay, perfect. So in our last episode, you said that an athlete does not have to eat a stick of butter or go keto to improve their fat max. However, you said that improving fat max, that nutrition was really, really important, and it contributed up to 75% of the improvement. So can you talk a little bit about how you use nutrition to improve an athlete's fat max wattage?
It's really just, I hope you can hear my mouse clicking actually.
No, that's fine.
So
makes it real.
Okay. I guess I want to preface this with, yes, I am certified in metabolic efficiency testing, and but Bob has he has a great website with a lot of information, and he has a couple of excellent books, some with like the ideology behind it and others, and a recipe book.
I've read all of them. They're great.
Yeah, so they're very I think that those are probably very worthwhile for everyone to get, because we're not talking crazy nutrition here. So I think the biggest thing people learn, or when someone comes and gets tested by me and we sit down and we look at their nutrients, there's some pretty standard kind of numbers like that. I think a lot of people would agree on that if you're going to keep some lean muscle mass on an endurance athlete, it should be around 0.85 to 0.9 grams per kilo.
Okay.
So, so you take a 175 person and they need 175 grams of protein a day and they're eating 50. I'd say that's 75 to 80% of the people I meet. So they're not actually on this really high carb ratio diet. They're just eating too little protein, which throws off the ratio. So, because a lot of people in the world, they're trying to cut back on their carbs and they're doing this and they're doing that. So they're actually not in a bad carbohydrate place.
Okay.
But it's the ratio of carbs to protein that changes the insulin response that affect how our bodies work and how we utilize fat, and also kind of how we look in the mirror and how much we store in our body. Okay. So I think the first thing to look at is, if you just take it in the simplest form, it's whatever your body weight is in pounds. Okay. Try to eat 0.9 times that in grams of protein per day.
Okay.
That's sort of a maintenance thing, right? If you're lifting and you want to gain muscle, it's going to be over 1, but 0.9 is a pretty good, well agreed upon number.
Okay.
And take a look at your nutrition first and see how far are you off from that number. And I'll say most people are going to be 50 to 65%, so they're not even close.
Wow.
So then the next thing and Bob has a great thing that he calls the hand model, and it's generally, there's a bunch of different steps you can take to work on this nutrition accuracy. But number one thing I like to get people to do is see how their protein intake is on sort of a number that most people would agree is safe and healthy to maintain lean muscle mass for an endurance athlete. And then Bob uses something called a hand model. And basically, you take one palm is carbohydrates and the other palm is protein. And every time you eat something, they need to be equal.
Okay.
And so if you just use the hand model and figure out how much protein you need to eat a day, then you can look at the amount of protein in that one hand and just match it with carbs in the other.
Okay.
Now you can talk all day long about what kind of carbohydrates are in that palm, but I think that gets personal, and I think that's where the nutrition conversation can get a bit sideways. But most people that are training 8 to 12 hours and trying to achieve the goals, I think that they're all trying to achieve, that if they live their lives mostly in a 1-to-1 ratio or maybe a maximum 2-to-1 ratio, that they'll find that their body composition improves a lot, their energy will improve a lot, and that will really help their off the bike improve their fat max on the bike. So, I have a lot of the athletes that I work with are kind of 285 to 335 watt kind of threshold people. They're all 46 to 58 years old. They mostly all of them work. And I don't know, the ones that have sort of chosen to make nutrition part of their life, they all function on a 1-to-1 ratio. So I don't like to speak about sort of percentages, but it really does, in generalities, it really does almost work out to a 40% fat, 30% carb, 30% protein diet. It's very, very close.
Okay.
But the hand model is great. If you just Google that, you'll get a lot of references from Bob and a bunch of great information. But I've had a lot of success with people finding their body composition changes a lot, that they were finding it difficult because their ratio of intake was just off, which was affecting their fat storage.
Okay. As far as fueling goes while racing, do athletes eat anything special? What recommendations or advice do you have on that? If you're doing a short race, obviously it doesn't really matter, but the Leadvilles, the Grand Fondos, that kind of stuff, what would you recommend there?
I think the biggest thing is that as far as what they eat, I find that too much protein in the mix generally causes some issues. So we're really just talking about sugar and electrolytes. I don't really have a huge association with any brand. People generally try different things that make them, that they like and that they can drink over time. One thing that is important is how much. So remember, if we have a low fat max, it means we have a high carb burning rate. And on the back of every package of almost anything on the market, it'll tell you a range of probably 175 to 225 calories per hour that you need to perform.
Okay.
But most people that are low fat burners, their carb burning rate is actually pretty high, and they need more carbohydrates per hour, say at 200 watts or 215 watts normalized power over a big long race, than they're used to eating. So number one thing I get people to look at is, if you're not getting tested, then I really have people kind of keep squeaking up how many calories so let's say they got one test done, they know they're a carb burner and they're not interested in changing.
Right.
Then they need to sort of figure out how many carbohydrates can they eat before they run into trouble. And that's just practice. Try eating 300 calories per hour. Try eating 320 calories per hour. And so that's the carbohydrate way to do it, and to have success and make sure you eat enough. How much can you eat without any negative side effects will help fuel your wattage over time, because it is math. If you push a certain amount of power, then you need a certain carbohydrate to generate that load. If you can raise your fat capabilities, then you need less carbohydrates to do that work. That's where it really helps people who have stomach issues, right? If you have stomach issues from carbohydrate, then you need to increase your fat max to lower carbohydrate intake to give your stomach a break.
Yep. Okay. Interesting. Man, I've trained for over a year for Leadville. I feel like I've done it all wrong now after we've had these 2 episodes. So I feel like I need to do it again next year and take your advice and work with you all year and see what the difference is.
But, I always tell people, if you're going to do a race, Who do you know that really feels as prepared as they ever thought they could be for something, right?
Yeah. I know it's race week. I'm all worried.
Yeah. But then what they do is say, oh, I'm going to wait. I'm going to do all this stuff. I'm going to wait till next year. But just think you're going to have a whole bunch of great lessons that you can learn off of, and maybe everything will go perfect.
It could. It absolutely could. Okay. All right. So we're at the end of the show again. We'll ask the watt point question. I think I know the answer to this. We answered it last time. You could add 100 watts to an athlete's Fat Max. You got any different things you want to add to that?
No, I mean, because this watt point question is really just a deeper look at the original watt point question. So, it is possible to take your Fat Max from 100 watts to 250 watts, and there's a bunch of health benefits and other benefits that can go along with that. But I don't think so. I think there's a lot of positive things that come out of looking at nutrition and training. I think almost easier to get more improvement.
Okay. Well, Steve, you're a brilliant guy. I can't tell you how much I enjoy these episodes, the talks that we've had offline to get to this point. I love this stuff. I can't thank you enough for coming on again. Where can athletes go? Anything you want to plug or you want to talk about, you want athletes to see? What can we talk about for you?
Well, we're going to have a little bit of an online world coming to life within the next few weeks. And, I think there's a lot of great online training programs. I think there's a lot of great different coaches that have different things in the world. And I think the one thing that we want to try to get across on our website is really like how to do workouts a little bit more efficiently, how to do them better. So it's not that the workouts are really wrong, but what are these little fine-tuning things that we help people when we coach them privately do?
Okay.
So it's going to have a bunch of different levels, but there'll be a forum where people can ask questions, and then they'll either get answered by video or verbally by myself, or I just think it's something that's not out there in the world yet, and I hope it goes well, so they can come and visit there and check it out. And it's going to be a small entrance fee, and then there's going to be like a world of things inside. You can send in videos of your pedal stroke and have me analyze it, or you can book a consult and talk about nutrition. You can go get a test done and do all these things. So I think it's going to be kind of neat, and I'm not sure there's something like it out there, so I'm excited.
Oh, I'm excited by the sounds of that too. It sounds like it's going to be a great thing. So we'll obviously have to maybe talk about that in the future and let people know exactly what it is.
Awesome. Well, you have a good race. Good luck.
All right, man. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming on again. All right.
Bye-bye.
Hey, this is Chris with FLO. When we're not producing this podcast, our team at FLO is designing some of the fastest carbon fiber bicycle wheels in the world. As a thank you for being a listener of our podcast, Faster by FLO, we wanted to offer you 20% off your next purchase of wheels at flocycling.com. Head over to our website and pick up a set of wheels to make you faster at your next race or ride. Simply use coupon code PODCAST. That's PODCAST in all uppercase letters when checking out to get 20% off your order. Thanks again for listening to Faster. We hope you enjoy the show. Thank you for listening to this episode. Be sure to listen to episode 31 with nutrition expert Bob Seebahar. Bob helps athletes learn how to be better fat burners while training and racing. By combining Bob's nutrition advice with the training advice given by Steve Neal in this episode, you can learn how to become a fat-burning athlete. If you enjoyed the show, please help us by sharing our podcast and by leaving a rating or review. If you want to learn more about our company, FLO Cycling, please visit us online at flocycling.com. That's F as in Frank, LOCYCLING.com. You can also find us under FLO Cycling on Facebook and Instagram. Until next time, ride safe.